My name is Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup. I'm the Executive Director at Vermont Humanities Council, and I'm really, really excited to welcome the three of you to the Paramount stage. Thank you for being here and being willing to, especially the students, being willing to come up on the stage in front of your peers. I know that's hard, so thank you. Thank you very much. I need to thank a couple of sponsors and then we'll get moving real fast. But we need to thank the Institute for Museum and Library Services. It's the Vermont Department of Libraries, which is supporting the live stream and supporting this event, as well as Middlebury College up the road in Middlebury and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, who've made this event possible. I also want to say that Andrew spent all day with us yesterday in Montpelier. We spent a bunch of time in the State House. It was great to be acknowledging the power of the arts and humanities with our legislators, and we encourage you to do the same when you're talking to people in your community. Continue learning about these topics, engaging with these issues. In addition to the partners I just mentioned, of course, we need to offer a huge thank you to your schools, your teachers, your principals who supported this visit. The Vermont School Library Association, Marcia Castle, of course, who was really our partner on the ground, and the Paramount, Eric Burkett, for welcoming us here today. Please give them a big round of applause. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Andrew. Andrew was the digital director and policy advisor for Congressman John Lewis, and he also won a National Book Award as the co-writer of March, the book that you all received when you came in today. Some of you may have already read it. While working on Capitol Hill with Congressman Lewis, they wrote that book together, and it became a #1 New York Times best-selling graphic novel, and is now frequently either the first or second most read graphic novel in American schools. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you for being here. We look forward to the next hour.
Well, thank you, Christopher, for having me. Vermont is one of my most favorite places to visit. This is an amazing theater to be in. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Georgia. I was raised by a single mother. My father was a Turkish Muslim immigrant, and I got into comics because it was a place where I could read stories about people doing the right thing because it was the right thing to do. You know, I started with X-Men and Batman, and it went into indie comics and went from there. It was a place where, in some sense, I could find refuge, right? Especially at your age, the world doesn't always make sense and definitely doesn't seem fair. I can't imagine actually being in school right now. I think if you ever feel like things are hard right now, you should know that they are. This is a disproportionately difficult time to be in school, to be learning, to be growing up. The world is, in fact, on your shoulders right now. The only thing I would ask, based on my own lived experience, is that you show your teachers grace, because there's never been a more difficult time to be a teacher. For me, so much of my childhood, so much of my professional career was about honoring my mother. She put everything into me, and I was fortunate enough to win the National Book Award 6 months before she passed away. I was also fortunate enough, even though I grew up without a father, to have John Lewis be like a father to me. And I hope as you grow up, as you find mentors and people in your life who help you figure out who you want to be, that you understand that is a two-way street. Your job is to give them as much as they give you. In my own life, it was giving John Lewis March. It was convincing him that a comic book is a way to tell his story, to help other people understand it. And then it kind of got out of the box. We go to Comic-Con. John Lewis starts cosplaying. You know, like the trench coat, and we're leading the children's march. You should have seen it. It was a sight to behold. this icon, this congressman, walking around shaking the Hulk's hand. But that's it. You see the world the way it will be. When I first started this with John Lewis, nobody thought comics would be mainstream. Nobody thought this would be something you would teach in schools. But I grew up with them. I saw what they could be. You grew up on the internet. You're a digital native. Sequential narrative is your language, right? It's words and pictures working together. It's the oldest language in human existence, whether it's cave drawings or the labors of Hercules that Rembrandt did, or the triptychs that you see in old churches. They're all sequential narratives. And so when it comes to us learning our history, that's how we need to be, as a creative, how we need to be teaching it. But more to the point, the reason John Lewis's story is so important, as I said earlier, the world is on your shoulders. And we need you to understand how nonviolent civil disobedience is the only successful path forward to change. Congressman used to say, don't get down. Do not become lost in a sea of despair. Be hopeful, be optimistic. And that's what we need from you now. But when you see and read John Lewis's story, you need to understand that those lessons, the tactics that they pioneered during the movement, as a youth-led movement, are the best resource you have today for dealing with the challenges in front of you. So anyway, I've gone on long enough. It's an honor to be on the stage with both of you. Thank you for giving me a little bit of time here to talk to you. Thank you for reading March. If you notice when you read March and you start with book 1 and you see that young man opening the office, that's me. So I never have to actually put on a costume if I'm going to cosplay at a comic convention. I can pull a John Lewis. I just have to wear a dreadful suit. But I'm just really happy to be here. And thank you for your time and attention. Y'all ready?
My name is Callie.
My name's Amaya.
We're in 10th grade and we're coming from Rutland High School.
We represent Justice for All, a club that fights for equality and opportunity for everyone at the high school. Thank you so much for speaking with us this morning and for taking the time to engage with our questions. Given the controversy around teaching Black history, is there anywhere that these books have not been well received?
Look at this in context. When John Lewis and I started working on March, there was something called the 9-word problem. This was a term coined by the Southern Poverty Law Center. And it said that essentially most high school students graduated knowing only 9 words about the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, I have a dream, and that's it. The congressman and I believe there was a deliberate and systematic effort to keep the civil rights movement out of America's schools, to keep that being the only thing that you were told when you went through school, because if you understand your power, the ability that you have to organize, particularly at your age, because you are so free. You are so free at your age. This is also, if we get into it, this is the insidiousness of student loans, because that's meant to keep you down. It's meant to essentially turn you into an indentured servant. We believe that they were trying to keep this away from young people so that they didn't understand their power. And so we fought, and we went around, and we spent years going to schools and libraries, talking to school boards, getting March integrated into the curriculum, building essentially a campaign to fix this. And now March is widely taught, but look at the symbolism, right? John Lewis goes to Black Lives Matter Plaza in May of 2020. They've painted Black Lives Matter down the road in front of the White House, just like March is painted on the cover of March Book 3. The symbolism was permeating our culture. They had to fight back. So I would say perhaps there are many places where March was not as well received as one might hope. But I think there has never been a teacher or a librarian or a student that I have met that felt like it shouldn't be in a classroom. It's only politicians with an agenda.
While writing this book, did either of you worry that telling the story in a graphic novel might be inconsistent with the serious nature of the story?
So I love that you asked that question. One of the first times Congressman Lewis did a media interview, like a TV interview, right? He goes on Stephen Colbert. But this was before he was on The Late Show. This is when he had the Colbert Report. Y'all remember that? And he's in it, he's doing his character, and he says, is it dignified for a congressman to write a graphic novel, or is it dignified to write a comic book about the civil rights movement? And one of the things that I had done while we were making March is I wrote my graduate thesis on the history of a comic book called Martin Luther King and the Montgomery Story. And in the process of that research, I found a letter that was at the archives at Stanford University. And it was Dr. King in 1957, September, October 1957, offering his edits to the script of that comic book. And Jim Lawson, who was the congressman's mentor in Nashville, who you read about in book 1, talked about how he used that comic to inspire some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience of the movement. And so there was definitely that question that was permeating the media, the political environment at the time. There were a lot of people who didn't think it was dignified. But if you understand John Lewis, you know this is somebody who perpetually reinvented himself and who used non-traditional communications to spread his message over and over again. He used to joke that if only the civil rights movement had had social media, how many more people could they have reached? I think the flip side of that argument is that how many more ways could they have surveilled the civil rights movement? But in that context, John Lewis was never afraid of what was dignified. He was far more interested in what would work in reaching your generation. And he was right, and it did.
My next question has a kind of a long introduction, so bear with me. Students and staff are wrestling with how to handle the N-word in our school. While we agree that it should not be used in present-day conversations, the N-word appears in historical documents, literature, and films that are used for education. The N-word brings up issues about the freedom of expression and a need to teach history that is hard to handle. On the other hand, when schools are trying to create a safe space for all learners, inviting the N-word into the curriculum can be harmful and counterproductive. Since it's such a charged expression, can you tell us more about why you and Congressman Lewis decided to include the N-word multiple times in the book?
That's a fantastic question, one that I think we will continue to go over as we talk about this. Because I remember asking Congressman Lewis when I was preparing some of these scenes where the N-word is used, and saying, Congressman, what should we do? And the Congressman's answer was very succinct. He said, we can't sweep anything under the rug. We have to tell the truth, the whole truth. We have to make it real. We have to make it plain. I think right now what we're struggling with is the responsibility of language and respect for one another. I think when we deal with history, we have to confront the reality of it. We can't hide. But at the same time, we all have to be reasonable and rational and understand that this isn't a word you can just throw around. There is a loaded context to it that few of us have ever paid the price to fully understand. And so when you look at it in a history book or a memoir, you have to understand John Lewis is just trying to tell you the truth about what happened and what was said. But that doesn't mean that we go out and treat it without the respect for the history that we have an obligation to show.
Being an ally for social justice is hard. So what challenges did you face as a white person helping to tell the story from a black perspective?
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, I used to ask Congressman Lewis, I was like, what are you doing this book with a white boy? And the congressman was the first person ever to help me understand this. He would say, boy, you ain't white, you're Turkish. And then he would pause and he would look at me and he said, they call you the N-word too. And I think about that. John Lewis was so cognizant of the fact. It was the same lesson that Malcolm X gave in Nairobi, Kenya at the New Stanley Hotel in October of 1964 when John Lewis sat there with him and Don Harris. And he said, the only way we're going to be able to succeed is if we have a multiracial coalition of the poor. That we can't isolate ourselves. I have been oftentimes the first non-African American, non-black person to give a speech or to appear in many places. I was one of the first to win the Coretta Scott King Book Award just a few weeks ago. I was the first keynote speaker at the Martin Luther King Prayer Breakfast in Asheville, North Carolina. Or also the first one at Martin Luther King Day in East Lansing, Michigan. But I think the congressman's point of view, the reason he pushed me so hard to step into this role was because to him, seeing us on stage together, the two of us, black and white, young and old, was a demonstration of what he believed the beloved community should look like. And it's only when we come together, when we model what it is to not be black, but to give ourselves to the black struggle. Because I think oftentimes we relegate black history to this corner, and we say it is black history. But the truth is it's American history. I grew up in the South. I grew up in Atlanta. I went to the King Center as a child. You know, I heard the stories, I heard the lessons. But more than anything, I grew up in a household where people of all different races and ethnicities and colors were just a part of my daily life. And I didn't realize how much of that was a part of who I am until my mother passed away. And her service happened. And I looked around the reception afterwards, and I realized that there was no majority. That it was different people from different races and different ethnicities and different social classes and everything. And it made me realize that my mother had done it right. That the way she lived her life, the way she raised me, the way she created our home was in such a way that everyone was welcome. And not just saying that they're welcome, but bringing them in. Making the effort to build those relationships, to be close, to build a family that looked like the beloved community that Dr. King and John Lewis and so many others gave their lives trying to build. And I think there's never been a more important time for many, many ethnic groups now, or racial groups, to have allies. We're all under attack, and we've all got to stick together.
What did you learn about yourself co-writing this book? Did your view of the civil rights movement change by writing this series?
Yeah, it did a lot. You know, growing up in Atlanta, they tell you a lot about what I call gods and kings. LBJ versus Martin Luther King versus Malcolm X. But what I never even hearing the stories from John Lewis, it wasn't until we got into the nitty-gritty of making March, of reading the after-action reports, the meeting minutes, seeing the old SNCC student voices, the old photographs, that you realize how much of an impact that young people had on the civil rights movement. So many of the most radical reforms that today we take for granted, but back then were considered truly radical. For instance, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 originally required a 6th grade education to register and vote. It was the young people of SNCC who pushed back on that, who said that was unacceptable, that the only requirements to vote should be age and residency. Something we take for granted as self-evident today, right? But I did not know growing up, no one told me that it was these young people, these 18, 19, 20, 21, 22-year-olds, who had the courage to stand up against the presidential administration, even against the leaders of the civil rights movement, the so-called Big Six, to say that that's not acceptable, that everyone should be able to register and vote and participate in the democratic process. And so, as I look back on it, I am perpetually impressed at how the radicalism of youth has advanced all of our lives. And I just hope that we can all take that lesson away so that you and your generation can continue that.
We get a sense of the sacrifices that John Lewis personally made, but how did the congressman's activism affect his family throughout his life?
Oh, that's a good question. You know, I'm close to Congressman's son, John Miles. We've known each other for years, and we spend a lot of time together still. And I think the honest truth is that Congressman Lewis had to sacrifice many elements of his personal life in order to be who he became. The late nights, the long trips. But I also saw a family around him that felt like taking care of him was their way to contribute to the cause. You may not know this, but John Miles is an amazing cook. He can make ribs and brisket and anything else you can think of, right? And it's delicious. It's one of my favorite things. He'll make a rack when I come over to the house. And I'll be too busy eating to talk sometimes. And I think about that because, especially in the last several years of the congressman's life, it was John Miles that the congressman came home to after Mrs. Lewis passed. And there he would be cooking dinner, his own son, making sure that the man got fed. And I knew how important that was because every time we would do one of these events, right, we would have a reception or a dinner, and John Lewis wouldn't eat. He's at the reception, he doesn't want someone to see him eating, you know, he'd be like, I look like a cow chewing cud. And so it meant so much more when you really understood how he would put his whole life ahead, or his whole life behind him, just so he could focus on the mission. And but don't get it twisted. Mrs. Lewis, his wife, she was a strong, powerful woman. She was smart. She was a librarian. In many ways, I'm pretty sure she's the one who convinced Congressman Lewis that my little comic book idea wasn't such a bad idea after all. And she was such an important part of his life. First of all, John Lewis did not learn how to drive till he was 46 years old. And so for 6 of those years, or 8 of those years, Mrs. Lewis was his only source of transportation. But she was also his confidant. She was his best friend. She was his political advisor. There's a lot of people who say they were the campaign manager, but Mrs. Lewis was the campaign manager. And I think that's something we forget about too when we look back on the civil rights movement, when we look back on many of these political leaders, is that for all the men we see out giving the big speech, for all the men we see leading the march, there were women behind them making it all possible. And oftentimes we don't elevate their names, and we should. And we tried to in March. We tried to talk about Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer and Diane Nash and so many women of the movement who made significant contributions. But when you ask that question about his sacrifices with his family, the family itself made sacrifices as well, because they were right there with him.
Can you talk about the process of working with a graphic artist on a book? Do the pictures serve the words, or do the words complete the pictures?
We worked with a fantastic artist named Nate Powell. He lives in Bloomington, Indiana, but he grew up in Alabama. And I'll never forget when we first started trying to figure out how to work together. I'd never written a script before. I was a comic book reader, but I mean, you want to talk about in over your head. They're using words, I have no idea what they meant. And Nate was so kind and so gracious. He would always take the time to explain to me what he was about to do so that we would understand it. And I remember the moment I fell in love with his art. I had written a 2-page scene, and Nate turned in 4 pages for it. And it gave this life, this pacing that allowed the story to breathe, that inserted those little moments, those little panels that add so much depth to the story. And I knew that he knew something about making comics that would take me years, if ever, for me to figure out. Congressman used to put it another way. He would say, hey, this young man has the ability and the capacity to make the words sing, to make the words come alive. I won't do any John Lewis impressions today, I promise. But Nate gave us, well, to use another one of the congressmen saying, without Nate Powell, March would have been like a bird without wings. And so as much as my responsibility was getting John Lewis's story down on paper, doing the research, finding the quotes and the dialogue and the narrative and the reference, Nate's job was taking all of that and turning it into something beautiful, turning it into something special and magical. And don't just think of him as an artist. Look at the lettering. Look at how he lays out the words. This is one of the most important parts of comics that's also one of the most misunderstood and oftentimes marginalized. But the way he wrote those letters, the way he hand drew all of that lettering, it became like he was writing from the voice of God. His handwriting became that voice. I think one of the biggest challenges of comics and graphic novels is how do you not just tell a great story, but how do you build a great team? People who can work together night after night, year after year. And sure, you're like siblings. You're going to wrestle a little bit. You're going to disagree. But the congressman used to call us a band of brothers. He would joke that if we were a band, if we played music, our band name would be Good Trouble. And I think in many ways, Nate and Congressman Lewis's relationship is one of those examples where doing things together, forging a team, is a perfect encapsulation of how much more we can do together than apart. Nate, if you're out there, man, I love you.
Do you have another project now? If you were to work on another book that told the story of the Black Lives Matter movement, how might it be the same and how might it be different?
So I am working on another book. Let me tell you this story. Well, first of all, sometimes March made things a little absurd. I remember I had one Hollywood producer come up and they were like talking about March in the context of Black Lives Matter, and they go, "Could you make like March, but in space?" Space, right? Like it doesn't. There's this disconnect sometimes, and I was really sweet. I was like, nope. But when I think about what I'm doing next, so much of it to me is about the individual, right? A good book is about someone you believe in. And so I mentioned earlier at my mother's funeral service, my mother had a very close friend who, her name was Barbara, and she is Gullah Geechee, which if you don't know is a group. It's a culture, it's a population in the low country between North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia of people who descended from slaves, who also intermarried with Native Americans who were living there after the Civil War. And I had known Barbara my whole life, and I can remember her speaking their language, which is called Gullah, as a child, and I didn't know she was coming to Mama's service. I didn't even know how to get in touch with her, but the local paper had written an article about Mama when she passed, which actually would have irked her no end because it said National Book Award winning author's mother dies, and my mother would have really been, she's like, why do you go first? But Barbara saw it and she came. And I remember feeling so overwhelmed at the service. Just so many people coming, right? I mean, Congressman Lewis there. Everybody's like, oh, you know, these people, everybody's politicking. And I'm emotionally dying because I'm missing my mother so much. And Barbara shows up. And I hug her and I start to cry. And we talk for a little bit. And finally I asked her if she would speak Gullah for me so I could hear it again as a child, like the same as I heard as a child. And so she just starts talking to me like she did when I was a little kid. And it was the first time that day I felt better, that I felt like my world had not ended. And so a few months later, I met a woman who lived on Dufusky Island, who also is Gullah. And I won't get into the whole story. That's what the book's for. But when I talked to her, I felt that same comfort. And I learned about the life that she lived. And I learned so much more about the island that she lived on, Dufusky Island, which if you ever read The Water is Wide, she's Ethel in Pat Conroy's book. But it was such such a stirring and striking example of how here was this island that was full of black middle class people earning a living that then had their economy devastated because wealthy white corporate interests came in, built a paper mill, polluted the estuary, and destroyed the oyster culture that was keeping the island thriving. And it, to me, was the most perfect example or illustrative example that we could show of environmental justice as racial justice. How it is the people of color who often pay the highest price for our pursuit of profit, our pursuit of industrialization, and we don't stop to think about the cultures that we destroy. We don't look at it holistically and what the greater impact is. And so she and I have been working for about 2 years on a book. It'll probably be 2 more. I do not make books quickly. But for me, like as I tell these stories, I think there's a lot of young people out there who have really important stories to tell. And I think it's their story to tell. I feel like my job, my responsibility is to help the people who wouldn't otherwise have that opportunity, to bring them into comics, to bring them into schools and libraries. And Sally Ann's story is too important not to. So I hope at the end of the day what we create, also it's going to have recipes because she's like this amazing cook. And if you've ever had Gullah food, I mean the rub is she became a hospice care worker at one point to take care of her family. And as these people were dying, this is also part of why it resonated with me, as these people were dying, they stopped eating. And I remember when my mom stopped eating. But Sally Ann would make Gullah food for these people as they transitioned. And it kept them eating. It made the end of their life better. That should be celebrated. And so I want to bring that food, that culture, that history that comforted me to everyone else, so that you can learn about this small piece of America that's been overlooked and this important culture that is defined. I mean, if you want to talk about the origins of soul food, the Gullah people have a large part to play in that. And so I have this freedom, this privilege to be able to pursue my own curiosities. Something that, like when you grow up poor, when you grow up with a single mom, you are never, like the ability to make decisions about your own life in such a way is never something you think is possible. And I think for me, after Mama died, I made this decision that I was never going to make a decision based on what somebody else thought I should do. I was going to try and follow my heart as truly as I possibly could. And I'm trying really hard to stick to that. Doesn't always mean it's perfect. I definitely have this like caretaker instinct now that Mama passed, where I'm like, oh, you need some help? Okay, let's get you going. Let's button up your jacket. Let's make sure you have a snack, you know? But it gives me a sense of peace. And so I think when we talk about the Black Lives Matter activists, I want them to tell their story. I think there is so many portions of what has happened over the last few years that need to be examined, that need to be retold. But that isn't necessarily my role to play.
That's all we have. Thank you so much for spending time with us this morning.
Thank you all so much.
Does this still work? Yes, it does. I'm going to join you if you don't mind.
Come on down.
And you guys, can you stay? And can I put you on the spot a little bit and ask you a couple questions, as well as Andrew?
We'll try to answer.
You can tell me to shut up and go away if you don't like it. But this has been amazing. And again, I want to say thank you to the Paramount for welcoming us all here. Yesterday, Andrew, when we were in the State House, you said something that really struck me, that history tends to kind of flatten out what actually happened. And I want to ask the students about that, but I also want you to speak to it a little bit first. One of the things that came out of that comment was the simple fact that John Lewis was much younger than most of the other organizers that he's usually lumped in with, right, with Martin Luther King and so on, that he was in fact really a youth himself, right, that he was a college age when he started organizing. Can you talk a little bit about that kind of flattening of history and how it has, maybe de-emphasized the role that young people played in the movement? And then the question that I want to ask of you guys is, you're in the movement now, right? You're working in this. What is it like for you as young people to be in the movement today? What are you thinking about? So let's start with Andrew.
I'm glad you brought that point up. It kind of ties into some of the earlier questions, which is that John Lewis was 23 years old at the March on Washington. He spent his 21st birthday in jail. He was 25 years old in Selma. And that intergenerational conflict that existed, because he in some ways was the bridge, right? Like Dr. King was his mentor. John Lewis was the one that Dr. King looked out for. He gave him a scholarship so that he could keep going to school. And when you make these books and you read the different writings by different people, they become real people to you, right? They're not just characters. They live in your head, and they have personalities, and there are conflicts, and some people like some people more than others. I remember one of the favorite jokes I came across was there was a gentleman at SCLC named Joe Lowry, and Dr. King would tease him, and he would say, we call him Broadway Joe because he loves to see his name in lights. And that interpersonal play, that interpersonal relationships define so much of the movement. And we tend to, when you talk about flattening, we tend to take out those conflicts. We tend to look at them as if they were all working in lockstep, that they were all, that there was no rivalries, that there were no disagreements. But in many ways, what we try to show, and what I hope you see, is that SNCC had immense disagreements within itself and with other parts of the movement. I mean, remember, John Lewis did not march in Selma on March 7th, 1965 as the chairman of SNCC because there was such an intergenerational disagreement between the young people of SNCC and the older people in SCLC, Dr. King's organization. And we tend to flatten out those differences. We do not mention that when we go through and talk about Bloody Sunday. But when you look at it in your own struggle, in your own organizing, you need to see those differences of opinion, those conflicts, so that when you confront them yourselves, you realize that this is not new. This is just the way it is. It's natural. It's normal. But then be the John Lewis who won't let that rivalry stop him from marching in Selma. If he had listened to the other folks at SNCC, he never would have led that march on Bloody Sunday. History would have been profoundly different. And so you always have to keep that in mind as you organize, as you work, because these conflicts, these personalities, the challenges that presents, that's normal, that's natural, that's to be expected. The measure is how well you can overcome them.
It's definitely not easy to try to advocate for social justice at such a young age because adults don't take you seriously enough and your peers kind of think you're doing too much. So, and you're still learning. You're still learning about what it was like in the past and how to fix or improve the present and the future. So,
yeah, it's hard being in the movement. I guess not everyone really agrees with what you want, but it's easier to like embrace it when you know you're trying to change something for the good.
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to keep kind of going in that vein, and also, Andrew, I feel like I need to ask you to define SNCC.
Right.
Like
Well,
we
first-
use that acronym, but maybe not everybody knows that. Can you tell us a little bit about the history?
SNCC is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was founded Easter weekend, 1960, at Shaw University. It was organized in many ways by Ella Baker, who, if you read about her, was, to put it lightly, was a godmother of the civil rights movement. And it was specifically created in response to the sit-in movement. We often think of the sit-in movement as beginning on February 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina, with the Greensboro Four. But in fact, much like our misunderstandings of Rosa Parks, there was a much wider scale effort going on to create the sit-in movement. In Nashville, John Lewis's involvement began in late 1959 with test sit-ins that were organized by Jim Lawson. And so all of these groups who were in conversation with each other throughout the South came together after the sit-in movement had succeeded, or at least made inroads, and formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in order to organize these efforts of all these different student groups throughout the South. And then, of course, SNCC would go on to expand to be nationwide, and in many ways their mission statement was changed. I think it's worth, if you ever get a chance, go read it. It's in March, the mission statement of SNCC. It's deeply rooted in the Christian philosophy of love. I think sometimes that part of it is misunderstood, that this is about the social gospel, this is about caring for one another. But when you look at SNCC, it is perhaps history's most important example of a student-led movement and a student-led organization. Also, it's the same way John Lewis would pronounce snakes. He would call them SNCCs.
And to the point of kind of flattening out the conflict, he got kicked out of SNCC. Eventually, he had to kind of go his own way. What was that about?
In May of 1966, several conflicts came to a head. John Lewis was a devotee of nonviolent civil disobedience. And at that point, you're after the Watts riots. You've witnessed countless black bodies being beaten and murdered. You had the murder of Sammy Young. You had the murder of several activists in the South that perpetuated a conflict within SNCC about what the appropriate tools and actions should be going forward, whether nonviolence was still the path. At the same time, you also had a conflict brewing within SNCC over whether or not white people should be allowed in the organization. John Lewis took the position that it should be an integrated organization, that it was stronger that way. And people supporting Stokely Carmichael felt the opposite. They felt that it should be a black-only organization, or at least black-led. And you had the rise of this term that then came about around the same time of black power. And it wasn't the first time it was used, right? It certainly wasn't. This is a term that had been around for decades, but it captured a spirit and a moment. And in some ways, I can't blame at all the activists who were tired of watching their colleagues being beaten and murdered. I spent the last month and a half dealing with government responses to officer-involved killings. And I understand that pain and that frustration and how hard it is to maintain your principles in front of what seems like ceaseless, consequenceless brutality. But John Lewis, what made him so powerful as a symbol and an icon now is that in those moments when it did cost him everything, he refused to abandon his principles. And he believed that nonviolent civil disobedience, integration, and the creation of the beloved community was more important than even his chairmanship. And so he hung on as long as he could. The congressman referred to that ousting as a coup because he had actually already won re-election as chair, and then they reopened the vote in the dead of night after many people had gone home. And I think that's something that stayed with him for the rest of his life. I don't think he ever forgave Stokely Carmichael for that. But mean, such is life. That is a conflict we all have to deal with. And sometimes when we stand up for our principles, we do pay a heavy price, even amongst our friends and colleagues. And I think it marked a different chapter in the movement after that happened. You know, Stokely was not a chair as long as John Lewis was. John Lewis was a chair for 3 years. I think Stokely was about 14 months. And then, you know, you go into H. Rap Brown and other leaders. And they, of course, dropped nonviolence from the name. It just became the Student Coordinating Committee. I think for the congressman, violence was simply unacceptable. And he was willing to do whatever he had to do to adhere to that and to advocate for that principle.
Thanks. I'm going to go back to Rutland and Rutland County a little bit, and just, you know, really acknowledge that the work that you are doing is the movement still, right? Like there's this tendency to say that it stopped, right? That the movement ended at a certain point. And of course, March Book 3, the book ends, and we don't necessarily know what happens after that. Fortunately, there's now Run, which continues the story for a little bit longer, and I'd love to hear you talk about that at some point. But I just want to, you know, acknowledge that the movement has been continuous, and you are part of it. And the work that you've been doing over the last several years to make Rutland High School a more welcoming, socially just place is very important work. And I imagine it's been really difficult. And I wonder if maybe you can share with us a little bit about the work that you've been doing to make your community closer to John Lewis's beloved community.
I feel that when we first came up with the idea to create this club, we felt that Black presence and that type of thing needed to be shown a little bit more, considering the minorities in our school becoming increasing more and more and more. So this February we raised the Black Lives Matter flag during Black History Month, just as a little thing to recognize that the Black community in our school. Do you want to talk about what else we've done? We're thinking of going to read books to little kids about gender, sexuality, race, because that type of thing doesn't just affect older kids, it also affects younger kids, and to be able to accept your own heritage and culture is a big step in advancing and change.
You want to add anything? No, it's okay. Andrew, could you talk a little bit about Run, and maybe also that question of continuity of the movement? And I am looking very much forward to, in a couple of months, having our friend Kekla Magoon with us in Brattleboro. I'm sorry she can't be here, maybe another year. And she has written this really amazing book about the movement and the Black Panther Party in the 70s and 80s. And that is somewhat after the period of time that the movement, as we've come to understand it, was happening. But it is that continuity. Can you talk a little bit about Run and about that evolution?
Sure, yeah. Congressman Lewis felt like the civil rights movement to him ended on August 6, 1965, with the signing of the Voting Rights Act. But that wasn't the end of the story. And I think much like we dealt with in the ways that the post-Obama era developed, right? Where we have this great success and the pushback comes almost immediately. It became so important to the congressman and I that we have to tell the story of the pushback. It was 3 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act that the Klan leads their largest hooded march in Georgia in decades. It was less than 2 weeks after the signing of the Voting Rights Act that the Watts uprising occurs, not riots, uprising. And we lose that context. We lose, when we create these simple narratives that begin and end in a place, and we don't keep telling the story, we lose the context of what happened next. Because after the signing of the Voting Rights Act, it became a question of how do you actually exercise that right? How do you use it to build political power? The first instance of it within SNCC was Julian Bond running for the state house in Georgia. And of course, because he opposed the Vietnam War, because he supported SNCC's statement opposing the Vietnam War, they refused to seat him. Even though at the same time they had statues on the grounds of white Klansmen who had opposed American intervention in foreign wars, they refused to seat Julian Bond. And it is such a clear-cut example that we all should know of how the hypocrisy of power exists. And we ourselves, as we try and understand the ability to exercise our electoral power, we have to understand how these tools were used against the civil rights movement, even after they passed the Voting Rights Act. We feel like, I mean, look, March Book 1 came out just after the Shelby decision. For those who don't know, the Shelby County decision struck down a portion of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, arguing that Congress should have to change it and reauthorize it, and Congress is not good, period, no, at doing those sort of things. And it's so divided. It wasn't, they knew it wasn't going to get reauthorized, right? So we have to show how that struggle, which picked up August 7th, 1965, is exactly the same struggle we're fighting today. Same players, same battle lines, same interests and interest groups. The right to vote being granted or protected in such a way was a fundamental shift in our democracy. It was huge. And they spent the next 50, 60 years trying to cut it back, to undo that progress. And that's why we had to keep telling the story. It's not just, although we did get into Stokely and John Lewis and the coup, it's the murder of Sammy Young, it's Julian not being seated at the Georgia General Assembly, it's the disagreements within SNCC about how to proceed and actually execute that power. People forget, they think about Marion Barry as the mayor of DC, but it was actually at that point in 1965 and 66 that he starts pushing for programmatic solutions. He was saying, you know, it's one thing to have a rhetorical win, but I want a program, I want dollars. It's this fundamental question of, is America ready to share its bounty, its wealth with people of color? It's one thing to be able to go to the lunch counter, but what about having enough money to buy the hamburger? And that's why it became so important to keep telling the story. And that's why we did it.
Thanks. You know, yesterday we were able to spend time with a bunch of legislators from all over Vermont. And there is a lot of new people in the Vermont legislature right now, right? There's about 50 new legislators who are just starting out. And a bunch of the ones that we talked to were people in their 20s, right? Just out of college who decided to run for office. You know, what would you say young people should do if they're interested in following that path?
Well, there's a reason we called the next book Run. First you march, then you run, right? That was the idea. I think the thing you have to prepare yourself for as you start to look at electoral positions, you have to be prepared to love people. Congressman used to say, there are individuals who love the world, but they don't love people. And your job as a legislator is to love people and tell their story, to represent their story and their life and their passions and their desires in a place where oftentimes that gets sidelined. There's no lobbyist for happiness, but that should be their job. How do they create a truly more perfect union? I've seen a lot of elected people up close. I've known them, I've been their friend. In some cases, I've been their mentor. In some cases, they've been mine. And it is an incredibly difficult life to choose. There's no money. You're always scraping by. Everybody's unhappy with you at some point. You can't please everybody. And the measure of your success is how well you can stick to your moral principles that you declare as the reason why you're running, and how well you can communicate your values to others, to find commonalities, to build bridges, to bring people together so that you can actually change laws. Because a moral victory is one thing, A legislative victory is something that is permanent, or at least far longer lasting. And we've seen our laws being attacked over and over and over again. There are wealthy interests that there's no exhaustion point for them. They don't get tired. They just keep pushing and fighting until they win. And the only thing standing in their way now are these people who've put their lives into a profession that is not glamorous, that is incredibly difficult, incredibly taxing. I know it's not easy to say or popular to say that these people deserve our thanks and gratitude, because I get it. A lot of times politicians drive you crazy. They drive me crazy too. I spent 15 years in Congress. You want to talk about crazy? But they're sacrificing something. They're sacrificing a huge portion of their life to serve, to help. And I think a lot about what happened in 2010. We get Barack Obama elected president. And what do? We stayed home in the midterms. A legislator's ability to act on your behalf, to succeed, to build compromise, is directly related to our ability to organize, show up, and vote and win elections. So we have to make them into the legislators we want. We have to be loud. We have to put pressure on them. The March on Washington was successful in pushing for the Civil Rights Act of '64 because they put so much pressure on legislative officials. So as a congressman would say, sometimes he feels like we're too quiet. And now is the time to speak up and speak out, to make some noise, and then you know the rest.
Yeah, thank you. You guys gonna run for office someday?
Possibly.
Maybe. Please do. We need you. We've got just a couple minutes left. We're right about at time, and I know we need to get you guys back to school. Sorry about that. But I want to kind of give you the opportunity to close us out, bring us home, and I want to bring in Good Trouble. Can you close us out?
You know, when I first started working for John Lewis, it's not the John Lewis we celebrate today. It was a difficult time for him. I started in his office answering his mail. But I got to know a human being who changed my life, who showed me the things I never thought possible for someone of my station, someone who grew up like me, without wealthy parents, without influential friends, that I could do things that I never thought possible if I worked hard enough. It was just like John Lewis's life. He had done so much and been given that opportunity by people before him. As adults, we have an obligation to be that sort of mentor to these young people, to these students. And to the students, you have an obligation to fulfill the promise of all of those who put their time and energy into you. You have a responsibility. But never forget that you are more free now than you will ever be. You don't have debt yet. At best, your responsibility is taking care of a pet. And sometimes it feels hard. I remember at your age, I was helping my mom out with the finances of the house. I was working, going to school, trying to keep everything afloat so I could go to college. It's not easy. But this moment in your life gives you more freedom to fight, to organize, to be a part of the struggle, and to put pressure on your elected officials to create change. So when someone tells you not to get in trouble, not to get in the way, you tell them that that's not what you're going to do. You're going to find a way to get in the way. You're going to make a way out of no way. You're going to get in good trouble, necessary trouble. And together we can redeem the soul of America. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's give a huge round of applause to your student panelists as well. They did a lot of work to prepare for today. Thank you so much.